Scandal. Scandal. Do I have your attention? A scandal is an act that is immoral or illegal that evokes a sense of moral outrage and anger. This morning, I'd like to speak with you about scandal. Do you know, in the year 2008, the Pew Research Center conducted a survey on Americans' attitudes relative to the news. And they discovered that most of the time, the vast majority of people pay no attention to the news, particularly if life is good. If things are going along and there's no threat on the horizon, and people have better things to do than pay attention to the news. But when they do pay attention to the news, and they do in greater numbers when crisis hits, the Pew Research Center has categorized what kinds of news people are interested in. And even in these moments of heightened awareness, they indicate that only about 30% of the people care about the news. And of the categories of news that were listed in this study, celebrity scandal was at the bottom of the list. That at most, 17% of Americans are interested at all in celebrity scandal. I'm going to conduct my own Pew research here this morning. And I'm going to ask you some questions. I just want to know how educated and versed you are in celebrity scandal. And we're going to start with a fellow by the name of Bernie Madoff. Does that name ring a bell? How many of you know the name of Bernie Madoff? And so you're familiar that in, was it 2008 or 9? 2008, I think Bernie made off with $46 billion. And he made off with other people's money in the greatest Ponzi scheme in American history, and now he's serving a life sentence in prison. How many of you knew that? Can I see? Okay. Here's another celebrity scandal. Fellow by the name of Pete Rose. Have you ever heard of Pete Rose before? Pete Rose is a baseball player, who one of the greatest baseball players, arguably, in the history of Major League Baseball. He more hits than anybody who's ever played, more at-bats than anybody who's ever played, 3 World Series rings, 17 times he was an all-star at five different positions. He was the most valuable player of the league, and he was a manager. How many people here know why this once upon a time magnificent, great player is not in the Baseball Hall of Fame? Wow. What was the reason? Gambling, yeah. One more celebrity scandal for you. Back in the late 1960s, early 1970s, the 37th president of the United States was a man named Richard Nixon. And Richard Nixon probably should have gone down in history as one of the great presidents we've ever had. I mean, he ended the Vietnam War. He opened the doors to trade and communication and relations with China, the most populous nation on earth, and he struck a deal with the Arabs that has guaranteed that our economy, in spite of our horrendous debt, we continue to hum along, and the reason is that the Arabs agreed with Richard Nixon that they would sell their oil in U.S. dollars, and we would guarantee to sell them our military weaponry and protect their governments in exchange for them selling their oil in dollars. And otherwise, we'd be in a whole heap of trouble. But Richard Nixon kind of fell from the pinnacle of history into the dumps because of a scandal. What was the name of that scandal? Wow. You know, it's amazing to me. Here, the Pew Research Center has indicated that only 17% of the population cares about celebrity scandal. and 100% of those 17% attend the United Methodist Church of the Dunes. I have another scandal I'd like to share with you. This is the scandal at the heart of the greatest story in human history. It's a story about the birth of a baby named Jesus. According to the story, the character that we focus on first is a man named Joseph. Joseph is a carpenter, manual labor in a town of zero consequence, a hill country, out-of-the-way place called Nazareth. Biblical scholars speculate that there were only about 400 people in this village at the time that Joseph lived there. And hearing that news, we wouldn't pay any attention at all to the story, except that Matthew frames the introduction to Joseph with this amazing genealogy. Joseph is more than a carpenter. Matthew gives us 42 generations of history and lets us know that this Joseph is somebody worth paying attention to. He's a direct descendant of Abraham himself, and he also is a direct lineal descendant from the great King David. And the people at the time that Matthew wrote, they were hoping for another David to rise up and become king again, to replace that Roman puppet Herod, the Edomite, who sucked taxes out of the people and enriched Rome and himself at the expense of everyone else. This is believable that they would know who Joseph is. After all, it was just July when here at the United Methodist Church of the Dunes, we celebrated the 225th anniversary of the Coast Guard with a Coast Guard breakfast in honor of Coast Guard dignitaries, and the guest of honor at that breakfast was none other than the direct lineal descendant of Alexander Hamilton, who founded the Coast Guard 225 years ago, and this boy was only 10 years old, but everybody in the room knew who he was. Joseph, we're told, is betrothed to get married to a woman named Mary. When I went to college, one of my years, I attended the American University of Beirut in Beirut, Lebanon. Had the opportunity to study at the Near East School of Theology with a man named Dr. Ken Bailey, who had, for most of his adult career, been a missionary in Middle Eastern villages, and most of those villages at the time that he served there had not even been introduced to the concept of electricity. Dr. Bailey, in a course entitled The Bible from a Near Eastern Perspective, shared with me and with members of the class something about the marriage customs of Middle Eastern villages that haven't changed much in centuries. They did not have eharmony.com. They didn't, when people wanted to get married, it wasn't you didn't go down to the local watering hole and see who might be available. It wasn't even a matter of a guy going out and checking out a girl and dating her and falling in love and deciding that marriages were arranged. This was an extremely conservative culture. When I was in Beirut, we were given a lecture, the guys in this university program. We were pulled aside and we were told, don't get any ideas about any of the women around here. If you do, and you're not married and properly engaged, you could wind up wearing a cement jacket at the bottom of the Mediterranean Sea. To give you an idea of how conservative this culture was, at the American University where I attended school, the men's dorms were inside a wall that was topped with barbed wire and glass and an armed guard, and that was in one part of the campus. You had to go out through that gate, across the road, through another high wall, barbed wire, glass, armed guard, and walk to the other end of the campus to get to the women's dorms, and men were not allowed in the women's dorms. It was just anyway. Joseph and Mary had this marriage, in all probability, that was arranged by their parents, who, and haven't you thought, those of you who are parents, that you really would know best how to find a suitable mate for your children? You don't have to answer that. But this marriage would have been arranged, and back then, brides were not free. There was a price that had to be paid for the marriage contract, and the family of the bride, particularly if they valued the bride, would want to figure out how much the family of the groom was worth and then get as much of that as possible, and then the bride price would be converted to a dowry that would be handed to the bride, and that financial transfer from the groom's family to the bride's family to the bride was part of the glue that held this arranged marriage together. The contract had been signed, the bride price had been paid, and the responsibility of the bride's family, their honor depended upon it, would be to deliver the bride then to the marriage bed in virgin condition. Do you sense the scandal? Mary turns up pregnant. The marriage has not yet been consummated. And Joseph, this man who is a direct descendant not only of Abraham, but of King David himself, he's not the father. Have any of you read the Bible? If you're a biblical literalist, you will find in the Old Testament on several places where the penalties are spelled out, and there's no gray area at all for what happens to someone who engages in sexual intercourse outside of marriage, if you violate the marriage contract. And it's rather harsh. The woman and the man who perpetrate this wrong are to be taken in public and stoned to death. And the person who is the offended party is to cast the first stone, except in the condition, and I just discovered this week, if the person involved in this sexual immorality is the daughter of a priest, her punishment is to be burned to death. We're not surprised that the family of Mary cared enough about her that when they realized what was going on, they got her out of town. In a 400-person village, news would travel fast that the son of David, the person who could have been the heir to the throne, who was hiding out in their village, had been insulted in this way. They got Mary and they hustled her off to the hill country to visit her kinswoman Elizabeth. And we heard last week in Luke's gospel that Elizabeth is identified there as a daughter of Aaron, which meant that she was a direct lineal descendant of Aaron, the first high priest, and she was married to Zechariah. Her husband was a Levite, which means that he was a priest. And it's quite likely that if Elizabeth was a Levite and she was a kinswoman with Mary, that might make Mary a Levite too. And the daughter of the village priest in the village of Nazareth, with only 400 people in town, it was supposed to be a match made in heaven. The daughter of the priest the heir to a king. And now it had all gone horribly wrong. It's understandable that Mary's family would want to send her far away, and that this priestly relation would be the ones to care for her. Do you know in the Bible there's a provision made for fugitives from justice, that they created what were called cities of refuge, the Jewish people did, and the cities of refuge were administered by the Levites. They were places that people who were facing punishment could go to kind of, as long as they stayed in the city of refuge, they'd be safe. They could find sanctuary there. And even if it wasn't the city of refuge where Zechariah and Elizabeth lived, at least they had this priestly understanding of mercy. The amazing thing about the story, when Mary gets to visit with Elizabeth, there is no shame. There's no sense of guilt or of wrongdoing. There is a celebration of life, a sense of the wonder at the miracle of what God is doing with the children who are developing in their womb and the future that God has in store for them. Meanwhile, back at the ranch, Joseph's having a really hard time. Could you imagine the responsibility, knowing that your honor in front of everybody in the community has been besmirched, and the responsibility that if punishment is going to be made, it's up to you to lead the charge? I can imagine Joseph maybe wrestling with a sense of, well, I'll be the first to cast the stone, or I'll be the one to light the match, and then my honor will be avenged. And then knowing that you'd have to live with that for the rest of your life, what you did to the priest's daughter. He resolved he was going to take the quiet road. He was just going to divorce her, to sort of sever the marriage contract and hope it would all go away. But in the dream, an angel of the Lord came to him and said, Joseph, that child that Mary's carrying is of God. That child is going to do amazing things for the world, and I really want you to go ahead and marry her. Joseph woke up, and he did what the Lord commanded. You know, we don't know much about Joseph in the Bible. I mean, we know about his genealogy, and we know that later Jesus had other siblings. His brother James became a leader in the life of the early church after the death and resurrection of Jesus. The Bible identifies Jude as a brother of James, and biblical scholars think there may have been a couple of other siblings as well. But we don't really have any sayings of Joseph. There's no example in the Bible other than the other time that Joseph is mentioned is when Jesus is 12 and goes to the temple, but we don't have any examples of Joseph's great parenting ability. And after Jesus is 12, that mention in the temple, we don't hear about Joseph again. He just sort of disappears from history. But we know one thing indelibly about Joseph, and that is when the Holy Spirit nudged him, he obeyed. He obeyed. One of the things I love about this story, this scandalous story, is that God chose to become flesh and dwell among us, not in some hermetically sealed, Betty Crocker approved, good housekeeping seal of approval package. Rather, God chose to become flesh in all of human brokenness in the midst of a great scandal. I've often wondered what it would be like if I took a microscope and a spotlight to each of our lives and looked at you and your relationships in grand detail. I'm not going to ask you to raise your hand for this, but I want you to know that if you did that to me, in my extended family, and we're talking really extended, but there are words that fit, like abuse and addiction and divorce and prison. Do you have some of those words that impact you too? I broke my leg in Israel in 2001. And what I discovered in my healing was that there were all kinds of people that tried to be helpful, but the people that I found most helpful were people who'd been broken like I was, who were in therapy with me, who knew and understood what I was going through. I believe that God became flesh in the midst of a scandal that we might identify with God and God with us. Some years ago, I attended a leadership training event in Minneapolis, Minnesota. The headliner at that event was a pastor named Eugene Peterson, who's best known for being the author of one of the most popular paraphrases of the Bible on the market called The Message. But the undercard was a CEO of a Fortune 500 company. And when that CEO had finished his presentation in the group, they had time for question and answer from the audience. And a person at the back of the room stood up and raised his hand, and they had a fellow with a microphone, and he took the microphone and he passed it to the guy in the back of the room. And he said, thank you. There's something that I need to say. And he turned to the presenter and he said, Max, haven't seen you for a while. I heard you were going to be here, and I drove a couple 100 miles because I just wanted to say thank you. You see, he said, once upon a time I was a pastor, and I was a pastor of one of the largest churches in the United States. And things were going well, and ministry was spectacular, and I made some mistakes. I started to have extramarital affairs with some of the women in the church, and I thought I could do it all, but the word got out, and when the elders of my church found out about it, they fired me. My marriage fell apart. When it hit the newspapers, it was awful. And I was so ashamed. I locked myself in my house and went into hiding. I couldn't leave. I was a recluse for a couple of months, only going out when I absolutely had to the store, and then I came back and locked myself in again. Finally, after a few months, I decided I just had to get out and resume living. And so the first place I decided to go was a football game on Friday night. And in our hometown, that was a place where I had fond memories. I'd walk by the stands, and everybody would know me, and I'd know them, and I'd talk to them, and they'd call to me, and sometimes they'd invite me to come sit with them, or they'd invite me over afterwards, and we'd catch up on things that were going on. He said that Friday night, when I went to the game, I walked by the stands, and nobody said anything. And I knew that they knew me, and I knew them, and I could feel their eyes, but nobody said hello, and nobody waved, and I felt so alone. He said, I saw a place in the stands way up in the back where there was nobody, and I went up there, and I just sat down, and I was so depressed. I thought about suicide and ending my life. And Max, he said, that's when you got up from the middle of the crowd. You were the one person in that stadium that knew more people than me. And you got up from where you were seated and you walked all the way over and you climbed up into the stands where I was. And you sat down next to me and you put your arm around me and you told me that you loved me and were praying for me. And if there was anything that you could do for me, you would do it. And then you did it. You sat there with me for the rest of the game. Max, I haven't seen you since that moment. But I had to come and tell you that because you were with me, I am still alive, and I just wanted to say thank you. Can you hear the gospel? The good news of a God who knows us in our brokenness and has come all the way to where we are to let us know that we too are loved. Amen.